Tonight, we walk a road that no longer remembers how to be found, not because it was destroyed by armies, or swallowed by earthquake, or buried beneath the advancing march of sand, but because it chose in its own way to leave, to step back from the world of visible things and become something quieter, a memory held in earth, a whisper beneath the feet of those who pass unknowing over its hidden length. This is a story about disappearance, but not the violent kind, not the sudden catastrophe that leaves rubble and ash. This is about the gentler vanishing, the slow retreat of something that understands when its time has passed, when holding on would be more burden than blessing. It is said that empires leave behind great monuments, walls that pierce the sky, temples carved into mountainsides, roads that march across continents in defiant straight lines. We expect stone to outlast us. We trust that what we build with such effort will bear witness long after we are gone. But what happens when a road tires of being walked? What happens when the stones themselves grow weary of bearing weight, of marking distance, of connecting places that no longer wish to be connected? Whistles tell us that in a desert whose name has been lost to the same forgetting that claimed its roads, there once ran a path of pale stone. It was not the longest road, nor the widest, nor the most celebrated, but it was loved by those who walked it, trusted by caravans, marked by the small secret carvings of lovers, worn smooth by children's feet at dusk. This road connected 3 cities. Or perhaps the cities existed because the road connected them. For a time, the distinction did not matter. The road was there, solid and certain, a promise written in stone across an uncertain land. Merchants planned their journeys by it. Families sent letters along it. The empire measured its own reach by how far this pale ribbon stretched across the desert floor. Then, slowly, something changed. Not in a day, not in a year, but across the long, patient decades that stone understands better than flesh. The cities shifted. The caravans found other paths. The road, which had been essential, became optional, then forgotten. Then, finally, something stranger. It began to dissolve. Not crumble, not decay, but dissolve. As if the boundary between stone and sand, between presence and absence, was thinner than anyone had imagined. As if the road, reading in its own way the changing world around it, chose not to endure as a ruin, but to depart as a mystery. Tonight, we trace that departure. We follow the road backward through time, watching it in its days of purpose and trust. We walk beside those who knew it, loved it, depended on it. And then we stand witness as it teaches us something about endings, about the grace that comes not from fighting to remain, but from knowing when to let go. Beneath the silence of this story, a question waits. Not about the road itself, but about all the things we build and believe will last forever. About the moment when permanence becomes a burden. About the wisdom of disappearing before you are forced to fall. The desert is vast tonight. The stars are gathering overhead. And somewhere beneath the sand, a road that chose invisibility over ruin is waiting, not to be found, but to be remembered in the way all sacred things are remembered, not with eyes, but with the deeper recognition that lives in the soles of our feet, in the quiet spaces of the heart. Let us begin. In their hands, a parchment map, edges softened by countless foldings, ink faded to the color of old amber. The lines upon it are confident, drawn by a cartographer who believed in permanence. One line in particular runs bold and straight, a road connecting 3 cities whose names are written in script so ancient the traveler can barely read them. But beneath their feet there is only sand, unmarked, undisturbed. As if no stone had ever been laid here, no wheel had ever turned, no footstep had ever pressed its shape into the earth. The wind moves across the empty plain, carrying with it the faint scent of distance, the smell of a horizon that holds no promises. The traveler looks down at the map again, then at the ground, then at the map. The disconnection is absolute. They are standing, the parchment insists, at the beginning of an empire's greatest road. Yet the desert offers no evidence, no confirmation, not even the dignity of visible ruin. It is said that some roads do not merely crumble, some choose to leave. We drift backward now through the veiled curtain of centuries, into a time when this place was not empty, when the crossroads hummed with purpose, and the road was not a question but an answer. The road appears beneath us like a pale ribbon unfurling across the desert floor. It is wide enough for 2 laden carts to pass without their wheels touching. Its surface made of flat stones fitted so precisely that even the thinnest blade could not slip between them. The stones are the color of dried bone, quarried from distant cliffs and carried here with reverence, each one selected for its ability to bear weight without complaint. Along its length, the road runs straight and sure, guided not by the easiest path through the land, but by something older, alignments with certain stars, sacred geometries known to the empire's architects, invisible lines that connected temple to temple, well to distant well. This was the empire's main artery. Through it flowed grain and oil, silk and salt, letters sealed with wax, and secrets wrapped in cloth. Caravans followed it with absolute trust, their drivers knowing that as long as they stayed on the pale stones, water would be found at predicted intervals, shelter would appear before nightfall, and bandits would respect the ancient boundaries marked by the road itself. Where memory fades in other empires, it lived in this road's careful stone. At dusk, children would emerge from nearby settlements and play at its edges, drawing patterns in the thin dust that collected where stone met sand. Their laughter rang across the road's surface, and the stones, warmed by the day's sun, seemed to hold that laughter, releasing it slowly into the cooling night. Lovers met beneath specific mile markers, numbered pillars placed at regular intervals, each one carved with symbols of passage and time. Some of these markers bore initials scratched by nervous hands, 2 names joined by a spiral or a star, hidden low where only the careful eye would notice. These carvings were never official, never sanctioned, yet they remained the road holding them gently, making no judgment about what deserved to be remembered. Whispers tell us the road was more than stone. It was a living agreement between earth and empire, between intention and ground. Those who built it understood that a road is not merely a surface for walking, but a continuous act of trust. The trust that what lies ahead is worth the leaving, that distance can be crossed, that separation can be healed by passage. For many generations, that trust held. Caravans arrived on schedule. Cities grew at the road's 3 endpoints, each one feeding the others, sharing water in dry years and grain in lean seasons. The road itself required little maintenance. Its stones seemed content in their places, bearing weight without shifting, enduring weather without complaint. But the world, as always, turned. The first changes were subtle, barely noticed. One of the 3 cities began to struggle, its wells producing less, its harvests thinning, trade routes adjusted, bending slightly away, seeking easier water, more reliable food. The road still functioned, still bore traffic, but less frequently. Days would pass now between caravans, where once there had been hours. Then the second city faced its own crisis, not of resources, but of politics. A war elsewhere, in lands that seemed distant, sent tremors through alliances and partnerships. New routes were drawn that bypassed the old city entirely, seeking safety in anonymity rather than the exposure of well-known roads. The road grew quieter. Grass began to appear in the cracks between stones, not because the stones had failed, but because there were fewer wheels and hooves to keep the growth at bay. The mile markers stood unmolested, their shadows lengthening and shortening with the sun, counting distance for travelers who no longer home. It was during this slow decline that something strange began. Travelers who still used the road, merchants stubborn in their loyalty, pilgrims following old instructions, began to report a peculiar sensation. Certain sections of the road, they said, felt different underfoot. The stones there were not broken or dislodged, but somehow softer, as if the boundary between stone and sand had become less certain. One merchant described it as walking on a memory rather than a surface. Another said the road felt like it was exhaling, preparing to let go. Beneath the silence, a decision was being made. Not by any person or council, not through decree or destruction, but by the road itself, or by whatever collective presence emerges when stone and intention hold hands for long enough. The road, it seemed, understood that it was no longer needed in the way it once was. The cities it connected were dissolving or had already dissolved. The caravans that had given it purpose had found other paths. And so, with a patience that only stone can muster, the road began to depart. It did not crack or splinter. It did not sink dramatically in a single collapse. Instead, over decades that stretched into centuries, it simply withdrew. Grain by grain, the stones released themselves back into the earth. Where the road's surface had once been hard and definite, it became soft and suggestive. The edges, which had been so carefully defined, blurred into the surrounding sand. Cartographers who tried to update their maps found themselves confused. One year, a map would show the road clearly. 10 years later, another cartographer would travel the same route and find entire sections missing. Not destroyed, but absent, as if they had never been there. The lines on maps grew tentative, dotted, uncertain. Where memory fades, even parchment forgets. By the time the third city finally emptied, its last inhabitants carrying what they would toward more promising horizons, the road connecting them had become more legend than landmark. Some sections remained visible, pale scars on the desert floor. Others had vanished entirely, leaving only the faintest change in the color of sand, a slight firmness underfoot that might be imagined rather than real. The mile markers stood longest, those carved pillars that once counted distance and held lovers' initials. But even they, one by one, toppled or sank, their stone bodies settling into the same earth their road had already rejoined. The spirals and stars, the scratched names, the careful numbers, all of it sinking quietly, without ceremony, into the vast, patient body of the desert. We return now to the present, to the lone traveler standing at the crossroads that is no longer marked by anything but an obsolete map. They close their eyes. For a moment, they simply stand, feeling the ground through the soles of their feet. The sand is warm from the day's sun. A faint breeze moves across it, stirring the finest grains. There is nothing obvious here, nothing that shouts of ancient passage or vanished empire. And yet, if they stand very still, if they allow their weight to settle fully, there is something. Not quite firmness, not quite memory, but a suggestion, a faint difference in the way the earth holds them, as if deep below the stones still remember their arrangement, as if the road has not truly left, but only stepped back, choosing invisibility over the indignity of ruin. It is said that some things survive best by disappearing, that the most faithful roads are those that know when to withdraw, when to stop insisting on their own existence, when to let the earth reclaim what was only ever borrowed. The traveler opens their eyes and folds the map. They will not find the road today, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the road's final gift is not passage, but the understanding that not all paths are meant to be followed, that some connections serve best as memory, that what once joined 3 cities in stone can still join them in story, in whisper, in the quiet recognition that we all eventually must learn to let go. Above, the first stars appear in the dimming sky. Below, the sand receives the traveler's footprints and begins, slowly, to soften them. And somewhere beneath it all, the road rests, neither lost nor found, neither present nor absent, but existing in that sacred space reserved for things that chose their own ending, that walked away from themselves with grace, that understood when invisibility was a greater strength than permanence. Some roads crumble, others dissolve, and the wisest, perhaps, simply step back into the earth from which they came, leaving behind not ruins but a question, a soft uncertainty beneath the feet of those who stand where maps insist something should be, finding only sand, only silence, only the gentle suggestion that what matters most may be precisely what we can no longer see. Its course is still visible, a wide meandering groove in the desert floor, its banks softened by wind, its bottom scattered with smooth stones that once knew the caress of water. In the heat of midday, nothing moves here. No birds call, no insects hum. Only the occasional whisper of sand, shifting grain by grain, following the memory of a current that no longer flows. It is in this emptiness, this place of absence, that the pillar rests, half buried in the riverbed's pale dust, tilted at an angle that suggests both collapse and repose. The stone column lies like a fallen sentinel. Its surface is weathered, softened by centuries of wind and the occasional grudging rain. But even worn as it is, even lying on its side as if exhausted from standing, the pillar still carries its message. Numbers, carved deep into the stone, running in a vertical line down what was once its upright face. They descend, not ascend. They count backward, not forward, each number smaller than the one above it, leading the eye downward towards something that should be significant, toward a zero that the pillar itself never reaches, toward a destination that no longer exists, or perhaps never did. Whispers tell us that this stone is not alone in its strangeness. Or rather, it was not alone. Once it stood as part of a sequence, a long chain of markers that ran alongside the vanished road, each one declaring with quiet certainty how much distance remained. But remained until what? That is the question the pillar now poses to the empty sky. Its numbers facing upward instead of outward, counting for no one, measuring a journey no traveler makes. We drift closer, letting our gaze settle on the carved figures. The script is old, older than the empire that built the road, borrowed perhaps from an even earlier people who first learned to mark time and distance in stone. Each number is rendered with careful precision, the curves deliberate, the straight lines unwavering. Whoever carved these marks intended them to last, believed that future generations would stand before this pillar and understand its purpose, would read these descending numbers and feel not confusion, but anticipation. But understanding has fled, along with the road, along with the destination. It is said that if you place your hand against the stone, even now, even after all these centuries of silence, you can feel something. Not warmth exactly, though the sun does heat the pillar's surface by day. Something else. A faint pulse. A trembling so slight it might be imagined. As if the stone still holds within itself the memory of all the hands that once touched it in passing. Merchants checking their progress, pilgrims confirming their faith, children running their fingers over the carved numbers like reading a sacred text they could not yet comprehend. Beneath the silence, the pillar remembers standing. We sink backward through time, through the layered dust of centuries, until we see it as it was, upright, proud, positioned at the road's edge, where its shadow would fall longest at dawn and dusk. The road itself runs beside it, that pale ribbon of fitted stone, and along the road, comes a steady stream of travelers. Some pause at the pillar. They read the number, 47, and nod, calculating. They know what it means. They understand the countdown. 47 more miles until they reach the place that matters. The place that pulls them forward with a gravity stronger than any city, any market, any promise of profit or comfort. But what was that place? The pillar does not say. It offers only the number, assuming that anyone who walks this road already knows the destination, needs only the reassurance of distance, the comfort of measurement. In an empire where so much was uncertain, where wells could dry without warning, where alliances could shatter overnight, where even the stars seemed to shift their ancient patterns, this road offered something rare, a promise that could be counted. We drift further along the road's memory, and another pillar appears. Then another. They stand at regular intervals, each one bearing its descending number. 46, 45, 444. The road threads through them like a needle through stone beads, connecting them in a chain of diminishing numbers, a countdown that marches steadily towards zero. 60 pillars in all, it is said. 60 markers of decreasing distance, leading from the road's beginning to its end, or perhaps not its end, but its fulfillment. The place where the road's true purpose would be revealed, where the journey would become arrival, where the long, patient walk across desert and doubt would transform into something else entirely. Some believe it was a temple, not a grand structure visible from leagues away, but something subtle, sacred, half hidden in stone. A place where certain rites were performed that required the long approach, the disciplined journey, the counting down of miles, as a counting down of distractions, of worldly concerns, of everything that was not essential. Others say it was a spring, in a land where water meant survival, where every well was holy. Perhaps there existed one source so pure, so reliable, so blessed, that pilgrims would walk 60 miles just to drink from it. Perhaps the water there was said to heal, to clarify, to wash away more than dust, to cleanse memory itself, to baptize not the body, but the very soul. Still others whisper of something stranger, a door in the earth, an entrance to chambers below, to tunnels that ran deeper than wells, to passages that led not through space but through layers of reality itself, a threshold that could only be reached by those who had walked the full distance, who had counted down every mile, who arrived at zero having shed everything but intention. Where memory fades in certainty, it flowers in mystery. The pilgrims who walked this road left few records. Those who reached the destination, whatever it was, rarely spoke of it afterward. Some say this silence was required, a vow taken at journey's end. Others suggest the experience was simply beyond words, that what waited at mile zero could not be translated into language without being diminished, without being made smaller than the truth it held. We watch now as travelers pass the pillar, year after year, their numbers thinning as time moves forward. The pillar stands faithful through seasons and decades. its carved numbers neither fading nor changing, marking distance for anyone willing to walk it. Then something shifts. The destination, whatever it was, wherever it stood, begins to close. Perhaps it was buried, sealed deliberately by those who decided certain threat thresholds should no longer be crossed. Perhaps it was forgotten, its location lost when the last keeper died without passing on the knowledge. Perhaps it simply withdrew, the way sacred things sometimes do when the world grows too loud, too careless, too distracted to honor them properly. The pillars remain, but they no longer guide. They have become riddles instead of maps, their descending numbers pointing toward a zero that cannot be reached because zero itself has vanished. Pilgrims still come for a while. They touch the stones, running their hands over the carved figures, even though they can no longer read the ancient script. They sense importance without understanding it, feel the weight of meaning even when meaning has been lost. Some continue walking in the direction the numbers suggest, hoping to find at the end of 60 miles some trace, some sign, some whisper of what once mattered so profoundly that an entire empire carved its distance into stone. But there is only desert, only sand, only silence. One by one, the pillars fall or are buried or are carried away for other purposes. The road itself dissolves, and this single stone, our stone, Pillar 47, is the last to remain visible. Toppled at last by time or weather, or simply the weight of its own patient waiting. We return to the present, to the dry riverbed where the pillar now rests. Its numbers face the sky instead of travelers. The zero it once counted toward is no longer findable on any map, in any direction. Yet the pillar continues its vigil, still marking a distance that can no longer be walked, still proclaiming 47 miles to a destination that exists now only in the space between question and answer. Perhaps that was always the truth. Perhaps the destination was never meant to be reached, but only approached. Perhaps what mattered was not the arrival, but the counting down itself, the slow diminishment of distance, the gradual shedding of miles and concerns, the transformation that happens not at journey's end, but in the walking itself. Where memory fades, possibility deepens. As the stars emerge overhead and the desert cools into evening, you might imagine standing beside this fallen pillar, your hand resting on its weathered surface. You might feel through the stone something that cannot be measured in miles or marked in numbers, a sense that some destinations exist only as the journey toward them, that some zeros are meant to be approached but never reached, that the most sacred places are those that vanish just as we arrive, leaving us not with answers, but with the perfect, terrible beauty of questions we will carry forever. The pillar counts backward into darkness. The riverbed holds no water. And somewhere, perhaps, in a direction no map remembers, a door that may never have been there continues not to open, waiting for travelers who will never finish counting down, who will never reach zero, who will walk forever in the diminishing numbers between here and there, between known and sacred, between the mile we stand on and the mile we can never touch. Some distances are measured not in stone, but in longing. Some destinations exist only as their own forgetting. And the pillar, patient as only stone can be, lies in the dust and dreams of standing. Still counting, still faithful, still marking the way to nowhere with all the devotion it once gave to somewhere, teaching us that perhaps the two were always the same. Not the thin, hesitant fog that burns away with the first touch of sun, but something thicker, older, a blanket of white that settles over the desert floor, as if the earth itself is breathing out its dreams. You move through it slowly, drifting along the ghost line of the vanished road, your vision shortened to a few paces in any direction. The world reduced to soft shapes and suggestions. Then, gradually, something emerges from the pale shroud. Stones, not scattered randomly, but arranged. Low foundations forming rectangles and squares, their edges still visible despite centuries of sand and neglect. The outline of walls that no longer rise above knee height, thresholds that lead to rooms that no longer exist. A city's skeleton, laid bare and quiet, half buried in dust. It is said that every map once marked this place. At the 101st mile along the road, past the 60th pillar that counted backward to 0, past the destination that was never reached, this city stood, or so the maps insisted. Travelers planning their journeys would trace their fingers along parchment routes and find it noted here. A symbol, name written in careful script, sometimes a small illustration of towers or walls. But which city was it? That is where the stories divide, where certainty dissolves into competing truths. Whispers tell us that chronicles from 3 different kingdoms speak of this place, yet each kingdom remembers it differently, as if 3 separate cities occupied the same coordinates, the same earth, the same moment in time. The first kingdom's scribes describe it as a center of learning. In their accounts, this was a place where scholars gathered from distant lands, where libraries held scrolls in languages both living and dead, where astronomy and mathematics were pursued with religious devotion. They speak of long halls where students sat cross-legged on cool stone floors, copying texts by lamplight, of courtyards where teachers drew diagrams in sand, equations and star charts that would be erased by wind and drawn again the next day, of debates that lasted until dawn, voices rising and falling in careful argument about the nature of reality, of time, of the patterns hidden in numbers and sky. The second kingdom tells another story entirely. To them, the city was a fortress, modest perhaps, but strategically vital. Built on a low rise that commanded views of the surrounding plain, it served as a waypoint for caravans, a place where goods could be stored safely and disputes settled under the authority of garrison commanders. Their records mention thick walls, narrow gates, watchtowers that kept vigil through the night. They describe soldiers practicing formations in dusty squares, the clang of metal on metal, the disciplined rhythms of military life. The third kingdom remembers it as neither academy nor fortress, but as a place of healing. Their chronicles speak of waters that ran warm even in winter, emerging from deep springs beneath the city. Of the sick who came from great distances to bathe in pools cut into stone, to drink from fountains that tasted faintly of minerals and earth. They tell of attendants who guided the afflicted down into underground chambers where steam rose and echoes multiplied, where pain was left behind in the darkness and health was carried back up into the light. 3 cities, 3 truths, 3 memories occupying the same coordinates. Beneath the silence, a question forms. Were they wrong, or were they all correct? Perhaps this city was all of these things at different times, its purpose shifting with the centuries as empires rose and fell around it, as need changed and priorities evolved. A place of learning that became a fortress when danger approached. A fortress that opened its gates and became a sanctuary for healing when war finally passed. A sanctuary that transformed once more into a place of quiet study when the world grew calm again. Or perhaps each kingdom saw only what it needed to see, what fit its own narrative, its own understanding of what a city should be. The scholars noticed the libraries and ignored the walls. The soldiers counted the towers and missed the springs. The healers descended to the waters and never climbed high enough to see the broader structure. Where memory fades into contradiction, truth becomes layered rather than singular. You move through the foundation stones now, the mist beginning to thin as morning strengthens. Your feet find the outline of a street, still faintly visible as a change in the texture of the ground. It leads toward the city's center, where something taller than the surrounding ruins rises from the earth. A well. It stands open to the sky, its mouth ringed with stones that have somehow resisted the desert's patient erosion. The rim is wide enough to walk around, its inner edge worn smooth by countless hands, countless ropes, countless centuries of use. You approach it slowly and peer down into its throat. Darkness. Not the simple darkness of depth, but something more complete. A darkness that seems to have substance, that fills the well like liquid shadow. No water glints far below. No reflection catches what little light penetrates. Only that profound, waiting black. But there are steps, cut into the well's inner wall, spiraling downward. A staircase descends into the dark. The steps are narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, worn in their centers by the passage of countless feet. They curve out of the sight almost immediately, swallowed by the well's shadow. It is said that this well was never truly about water. Or rather, it was about water, but also about something more. The spring that once fed it ran deep, deeper than seemed necessary for a city of this size, deeper than practical need required. And the chambers that surrounded the spring far below were not simple cisterns, not mere storage for life's most precious element. They were rooms. We descend now in imagination alone, following the spiral stairs down into the cool darkness. The air changes immediately, growing denser, heavier, carrying the mineral scent of stone that has never seen sun. The walls press close on either side, damp to the touch, marked here and there with faint scratches. Words, perhaps, or simple marks counting the passage of time, of visits, of descents made. Sense complete. Down and down the stairs went, turning in their slow spiral, each step taking you deeper beneath the surface, beneath the city's scattered foundations, beneath the level where light reaches or memories live. Then the staircase opens. A chamber spreads before you, carved directly from the living rock. It is not large, but its proportions are careful, deliberate. The ceiling curves overhead like the inside of a shell. The floor is smooth, polished by water that once covered it, now dry except for a faint dampness that clings to everything. Around the walls, at shoulder height, shallow niches are cut into the stone. They are spaced evenly, each one shaped like a small alcove. Each one empty now, but bearing the marks of what they once held. Faint discolorations on their floor suggest scrolls or books, objects that rested there for years before being removed or simply dissolving into dust. Below these niches, carved benches line the curved walls, their surfaces worn smooth by the bodies of those who once sat here. How many? How often? For what purpose? Where memory fades in chronicles, it persists in stone. In one corner of the chamber, another passage opens, leading to a second room, then a third. A network of spaces, all connected, all carved with the same patient precision. In one room, the ceiling is higher, and niches in the walls are shaped differently, like perfect stars six-pointed, each one bearing the faint residue of soot, as if lamps burned there once, their flames multiplying in reflection off the damp walls, turning the chamber into a constellation brought underground. In another room, channels are cut into the floor, forming patterns, spirals and straight lines, geometric shapes that might have guided the flow of water when the spring was active, or might have served some other purpose entirely. A map, perhaps, drawn not on parchment, but in stone, meant to be walked rather than studied, meant to be felt through the soles of bare feet, rather than understood through the eyes. The city above had its walls, its streets, its visible architecture. But here, beneath it all, was the city's true heart, a place for going inward rather than displaying outward, a place where knowledge was kept, not in grand halls, but in small secret chambers, where healing happened not in public pools, but in quiet descent, where the fortress protected not its exterior, but its interior. These passages, these rooms, these spaces carved into the earth's body, like thoughts carved into memory. Perhaps this is why the chronicles disagree. Perhaps what stood above ground changed many times, walls built and torn down, purposes shifting with political winds, names changing with new rulers. But below, in the constant cool of these chambers, something remained unaltered. The true city, hidden in depth, continuing its quiet work, regardless of what story the surface chose to tell. We rise now, following the spiral stairs back up toward light. The ascent feels longer than the descent. the way returning always seems to take more time than arriving. The walls narrow, the air warms, the darkness gradually loosens its hold, replaced by the grey half-light of the well's upper reaches. You emerge into morning fully arrived. The mist has burned away. The sun is climbing. The scattered foundations of the city look even more sparse in the clear light, even less certain. A few low stones, some barely visible lines in the sand. Nothing that would suggest the complexity hidden below. The network of chambers and passages, the careful architecture of depth. The well's mouth remains open to the sky, a circular portal between the world above and the world below. No bucket hangs from its edge. No rope waits coiled on its stones. It serves now not as a source of water, but as a source of breath, inhaling the cool air from the chambers below, exhaling it into the warming day, then reversing as night falls, breathing in starlight, breathing out the secrets of stone. You stand at its edge, looking down one final time. The darkness below is absolute, revealing nothing, yet knowing what lies there. The stairs, the chambers, the niches that once held knowledge, the benches worn by unknown bodies, the star-shaped alcoves for lamps long extinguished, changes everything. The city exists now only as depth, not height, not breadth, but the vertical dimension of going down, of going in, of descent as destination. Perhaps that was always its true nature, and the structures above were merely doorways, merely invitations to find the real city hidden below. Where memory fades on the surface, it deepens underground. As the desert grows warmer and the day claims its dominion, you might imagine that this is true not just of cities, but of everything. That beneath every visible surface lies another layer, more true, more essential. That the monuments we see are less important than the chambers we cannot. That what endures is not what rises highest, but what goes deepest. The well breathes, the city sleeps in stone. And somewhere in the darkness far below, in rooms that no one visits, the walls still hold their secrets. Not lost, but simply waiting in the patient dark, in the cool and constant depth, for someone willing to descend, to spiral down, to trade the bright certainties of the surface for the profound mysteries that live only in going inward, in going down, in finding that the truest cities are always built, not toward the sky, but toward the center of the earth, high on a ridge where the land rises to meet the sky with quiet dignity. Stone pillars stand against the horizon. They are not tall, barely twice the height of a person, but their presence is absolute. 4 of them, spaced at careful intervals across the ridge's spine, their surfaces weathered smooth by wind and time, their bases anchored in bedrock as if they have grown there rather than been placed. Between them, nothing remains. No arch, no roadway, no deck of timber or stone. Only the pillars themselves, rising like questions into the empty air. It is clear, even from a distance, what these stones once supported. A bridge. But beneath them, there is no river. No canyon carves its way through the ridge. no gorge drops away into shadow. The ground between the pillars is level, solid, continuous. A stretch of barren earth scattered with small stone and the occasional stubborn shrub. Nothing that would require a bridge. Nothing that would need spanning. Yet the pillars stand, insisting on their purpose, declaring that once something flowed here that demanded crossing. Whistles tell us to look not at what is, but at what was. We arrive as evening begins its slow descent, the sun hanging low and golden, casting long shadows across the ridge. The pillars throw their darkness eastward, stretching them into thin lines that seem to reach for something beyond the visible horizon. The air is cooling but gently, without urgency. A faint breeze moves across the stone, carrying the scent of distance and dust. You approach the nearest pillar, placing your hand against its sun-warmed surface. The stone is solid, unyielding, carved from a single massive block and hauled here by methods that can only be imagined. Its face bears faint marks, the ghosts of tools, the shallow signatures of chisels that shaped it generations ago. Near its base, water stains run in vertical streaks, dark against the lighter stone, evidence of moisture that once flowed here, that once touched this pillar with enough regularity to leave its mark. Beneath the silence, the memory of water stirs. We drift backward through time, through the accumulated centuries, until the ridge begins to change around us. The air grows heavier, more humid. The scattered stones soften into soil, and from the barren ground, a sound emerges. The sound that gives meaning to bridges, the sound that makes pillars necessary. Running water. A river appears beneath the pillars, flowing strong and sure through a channel it has carved over millennia. Not a vast torrent, but substantial, wide enough that crossing it would require thought, deep enough that wading would be treacherous. The water moves with purpose, coming from highlands we cannot see, travelling toward lowlands beyond the ridge, following the patient commands of gravity and stone. The bridge appears whole above it. Between the four pillars, a roadway spans the river's width. The construction is elegant in its simplicity. Thick wooden beams laid across the pillars' tops, planks fitted tightly above them, the whole structure wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The road we have been following, that pale ribbon of fitted stone, continues across this bridge, without breaking stride, as if the river is merely a momentary interruption, a brief pause in the road's long conversation with distance. Caravans cross here regularly. We watch as a line of laden camels makes its way onto the bridge, their hooves producing a hollow rhythm against the wood, their bells chiming in syncopation with their swaying steps. Below them, the river whispers its own ancient song, indifferent to what passes above, concerned only with its own endless journey toward the sea. But it is said the bridge served more than practical purpose. The empire that built this road, that marked distances with backward-counting pillars, that connected cities now lost, that understood geography in ways we have forgotten, believed that certain places held doorways. Not doorways made of wood or stone, not physical thresholds you could touch, but thinner places, where the boundary between the visible world and other, quieter realms grew permeable. translucent, crossable. And they believed these doorways opened most reliably above moving water. Water to them was more than liquid. It was transition made visible, constantly flowing, constantly changing, never the same river twice. It existed between states, not quite solid, not quite vapor, but something in between. And in that betweenness, that liminal quality, lay its power. Above a river, the empire's sages taught, one stood suspended not just between two banks, but between two modes of being. The air above moving water vibrated differently, held different possibilities. Dreams came clearer there. Thoughts moved in unexpected directions. The mind, freed from the tyranny of solid ground, could wander into territories usually locked away. So the bridge was built deliberately in this place, not because the river was particularly difficult to cross, but because crossing it offered something beyond mere passage. It was threshold and portal at once. Those who walked across it with intention, who paused at its midpoint and stood in the space between shores, listening to the water below, feeling the vibration of its flow through the soles of their feet, reported experiences that could not easily be explained. A sudden clarity about problems that had seemed unsolvable. A recognition of patterns they had been blind to. A sense of connection to something vast and patient that flowed through all things the way the river flowed through stone. Some called it prayer. Others called it dreaming while awake. Still others had no name for it. Only the memory of standing above moving water and feeling, for a moment, that the boundaries of self had become negotiable, that what they were and what the river was, and what the wind was, had briefly merged into a single breathing wholeness. Where memory fades in doctrine, it persists in experience. The bridge became known, quietly, as a place to go when seeking answers that could not be found in books or purchased from merchants. Travelers would time their journeys to reach it at dusk, when the light softened and shadows grew long, when the barrier between day and night thinned, just as the barrier between worlds thinned above the flowing water. They would cross slowly, sometimes stopping entirely at the bridge's center. They would close their eyes and listen, not just to the river, but through it, to whatever the river connected to, whatever vast system of flow and current it belonged to. And sometimes, in that listening, what they sought would arrive, not as words, not as visions, but as a kind of inner shift, a realignment, a recognition that the question they'd been asking was not quite the right question, and that the real question, once understood, answered itself. But time, as always, worked its changes. The climate shifted, slowly enough that no single generation noticed the full transformation. Rains came less frequently. The river, which had seemed eternal, began to diminish. First it narrowed, its banks widening as its body shrank. Then it grew shallow, rocks appearing in its bed that had been hidden for centuries. Then it became seasonal, flowing only after rare storms, dry the rest of the year. Finally, it ceased entirely. The channel remained, carved deep into stone by the patient work of millennia. But no water moved through it. The river had migrated elsewhere, found another route, or simply ended, its source exhausted, its journey complete. The bridge stood suddenly purposeless, spanning nothing, its pillars supporting a roadway that crossed only air and memory. One might expect it to be abandoned then, dismantled, its materials repurposed for other structures in places where bridges were still needed. But the Empire did something unexpected. They left it standing. Perhaps they remembered what the bridge had been beyond its physical function. Perhaps they understood that some thresholds remain meaningful even when nothing visible passes beneath them. Perhaps they knew that geography was never merely physical, and that a bridge built to span water and worlds did not become useless simply because the water had departed. We return to the present, to the ridge where only the pillars remain, where even the roadway has finally surrendered to time, leaving only these 4 stone witnesses to mark where crossing once happened. Evening has deepened. The sun touches the horizon, painting the sky in layers of gold and violet and deepening blue. The pillars cast their shadows one final time before darkness claims them. It is said that travelers still come here, though the road is gone and no map marks this place. They come not because it leads anywhere, but because it doesn't, because it has become pure threshold without destination, pure crossing without arrival. Some camp near the pillars overnight, building small fires at their bases, watching the stars emerge overhead, and they report, these solitary travelers, dreams of unusual clarity, dreams where solutions present themselves to problems they hadn't consciously known they were carrying, dreams where the boundaries between past and future blur, where they see themselves as both who they were and who they might become, suspended in the eternal present of the bridge that spans nothing and everything. The bridge, it seems, still functions, not in carrying traffic from bank to bank, but in holding open a space where crossing can happen in deeper ways. The water is gone, but the threshold remains. The destination has vanished, but the passage persists. Where memory fades in rivers, it flows in stone. As full darkness settles and the first stars multiply overhead, you might stand between these pillars yourself, in your mind, feeling the cool air of night against your skin. You might close your eyes and listen, not for water that no longer flows, but for whatever it is that water was always pointing toward. That sense of movement beneath stillness, of flow beneath permanence, of the truth that all boundaries are more permeable than they appear. Perhaps the Empire knew something that we are still learning, that the most important bridges span not rivers, but states of being, that the crossings that matter most are internal, that geography was never merely about land and water, but about the territories of consciousness, the landscapes of possibility, the distances between who we are and who we might become. The pillars stand. The air between them holds its secrets. And somewhere in the space where a bridge once was, and perhaps still is, in a dimension we can visit only through dreaming or through the kind of waking that resembles dreaming. The crossing continues, patient and eternal, waiting for anyone willing to stand in empty air and feel beneath their feet the memory of flow, the whisper of passage, the eternal possibility of moving from one shore to another without ever seeing the river that makes all bridges necessary. Some thresholds remain even when their reasons vanish. Some bridges span forever, holding open the space between here and there, between what was and what might be, between the solid ground of certainty and the flowing water of transformation, inviting her always to cross. No walls rise from the sand. No stones mark corners or thresholds. No hearth remains, blackened by centuries of fire. No post holes interrupt the smooth expanse of earth. No depressions suggest where foundations were laid. No change in the color of soil betrays where human hands once shaped shelter from emptiness. It is as if the inn was never here at all, and yet it was. 3 separate merchants' journals speak of it. 3 different travelers from 3 different kingdoms, writing in 3 different decades. They passed through this stretch of desert at different times, carried different goods, sought different fortunes. They shared nothing in common except the road they followed and the inn where they stopped. And they all described the same impossible thing. Witnesses tell us the inn stood halfway between the cities. A day's journey from the last wells. A day's journey to the next safe water. It was not grand. No one would travel here for luxury or spectacle. But it offered what the desert could not. Walls against wind, a roof against stars, cool rooms where heat could not follow, and water drawn from a private well that never seemed to run dry. The inn had white walls. This detail appears in all 3 journals, noted with the careful precision of those who spend their lives observing and recording. White walls, plastered smooth, catching and holding the light. In the harsh brightness of midday, they were almost painful to look at. But at dawn and dusk, when the sun hung low and gentle, those walls glowed with a soft luminescence, as if they had absorbed centuries of light and were slowly releasing it back into the world. It was on these white walls that the shadows appeared, not the ordinary shadows of guests already arrived. Those were expected, unremarkable, but shadows that came first, before the travelers themselves, before their footsteps could be heard or their dust cloud seen rising on the horizon. The innkeeper would be working in her courtyard, sweeping sand from stones, drawing water from the well, preparing bread for the evening, when a shadow would fall across the white wall beside her. The shadow of a camel, laden with goods. The shadow of a horse, head bowed with exhaustion. The shadow of a person dismounting, their form stretching long in the angled light of afternoon. She would look up from her work, searching for the source, but the courtyard would be empty. The road beyond the gate would show nothing but its own pale line disappearing into distance. No caravan approached. No traveler rounded the bend. The desert held only its usual silence, its patient emptiness. Yet the shadow remained, cast against the wall as if by something solid, something present, something real. And the innkeeper, who had learned long ago not to question, but simply to trust, would set down her broom. She would walk to the rooms kept ready for guests. She would open shutters to air them, lay fresh cloths on sleeping mats, fill water vessels from the well. She would return to the kitchen and begin preparing a meal. Perhaps for one person, perhaps for 5, depending on how many shadows had appeared on the white walls. Then she would wait. Beneath the silence, time held its breath. Sometimes the wait was short, a quarter of an hour, just long enough for the innkeeper to finish her preparations. Then the sound of bells would drift across the desert, and the traveller would arrive. The same camel whose shadow had appeared. The same merchant whose silhouette had stretched across the wall, erunding as if summoned by their own future presence. Other times, the wait was longer, the shadows would appear in the morning. But the travellers would not arrive until afternoon, or even evening, as if the distance between shadow and substance could stretch, could flex, could accommodate different speeds of travel, different delays, different choices made along the road. But they always came. The shadow never lied. If it appeared on the white walls, the traveller followed. The innkeeper learned to trust this with absolute certainty. The shadows were not phantoms or tricks of light, but announcements, messages sent backward through time by travellers who had not yet arrived, but would. It is said the inn existed in a fold. Not a fold in space, but in time itself. A slight crease in the fabric of moments. A small wrinkle where past and future touched in ways they were not supposed to. The inn occupied the present, yes, but it also reached slightly forward. Its white walls catching not just the light of now, but the light of soon. The shadows of things approaching from the immediate future. Where memory fades into physics, mystery deepens. The merchants who stayed there rarely understood what they were experiencing. They would arrive, dusty and tired, and find the innkeeper already preparing their meal. Their room already aired and ready, water already drawn and waiting. They assumed she was simply attentive, watchful, skilled at reading the desert for approaching travellers. Only a few noticed the timing was impossible. Only a few realized she had begun preparations before they could possibly have been seen, before their dust could have been spotted on the horizon, before any sound of their approach could have reached her ears. One merchant, more observant than most, noted in his journal, "The woman knew I was coming before I knew I would arrive. She had drawn water for my horse before I had decided to stop. I asked her how she knew, and she only smiled and gestured to her walls, as if that explained everything. I looked, but saw nothing unusual, only white plaster, bright in the sun." Another wrote, "I arrived at dusk and found the inn already lit with lamps, as if expecting me. Yet I had told no one of my route, had made no prior arrangement. When I asked the keeper how she knew to prepare, she said she had seen my shadow arrive an hour before. I thought her mad, but the bed was soft and the food generous, so I did not argue. The third merchant's account is briefer but more unsettling. There is an inn on the western road where time does not move correctly. The keeper there sees what is coming before it comes. I do not know if this is gift or curse, magic or madness. I only know that when I arrived, she greeted me by name, though I had never spoken it. For years, perhaps decades, perhaps longer, the inn functioned in this strange manner. Travelers came and went, most noticing nothing unusual, a few carrying away stories they would tell in distant cities, stories that would be dismissed as exaggeration or invention or the fevered imaginings of those who had spent too long under the desert sun. The innkeeper kept her silence, tended her walls, watched for shadows that arrived before their sources. Then the road began to change. The cities it connected started their slow decline. Trade routes shifted. The careful network of travelers who had once moved along this path with predictable regularity began to thin. Days would pass between caravans now, then weeks. The road grew quieter, less certain of its purpose, and the shadows began to behave strangely. They started arriving earlier, where once they appeared an hour before the traveler. Now they came 2 hours ahead, then 3. The gap between shadow and substance widened, as if time itself was stretching, as if the fold the inn occupied was deepening, pulling further into futurity. The innkeeper would see a shadow fall across her wall at dawn and wait all day. The room prepared, the meal ready, the water drawn. The traveller would not arrive until sunset. She would see a shadow at noon and wait through evening and night, and the traveller would finally appear the next morning, wondering why she looked so tired, why her eyes carried the weight of a vigil he could not understand. Then the shadows began arriving days ahead, a week ahead. The innkeeper would prepare rooms that remained empty for so long she would have to clean them again before the guests finally arrived, if they arrived at all. Because now, sometimes, the shadows appeared, but the travellers never came. As if somewhere between the shadows casting and the body's arrival, something had changed. A decision was made differently. A route was altered. A life ended before it could complete the journey the shadow had promised. Beneath the silence, the inn was unraveling. Where memory fades, time loses its anchor. It is said that in the inn's final days, shadows appeared weeks ahead of their travellers, months ahead. The innkeeper, growing old now, would see forms cast on her white walls and know she would not live long enough to see them arrive. She prepared rooms anyway, drawing water for horses that would drink it after she was gone, lighting lamps for guests who would arrive to find only emptiness. The last entry in the third merchant's journal, written years after his initial visit, contains a single cryptic line. I returned to the inn where shadows come first, but found only desert. The keeper is gone. The walls are gone. Yet as I stood where I remembered the gate had been, I saw my own shadow fall across sand that should have been white plaster. I saw it before I felt the sun shift. I saw it before I moved. The inn did not crumble or burn. It did not fall to raiders or collapse in storms. It simply ceased to occupy the present. Perhaps it moved. Perhaps, having existed always slightly ahead of its time, It finally stepped completely forward, through the fold, through the crease, into a moment we have not yet reached. Perhaps it waits there still, in a tomorrow we are walking toward. Its white walls catching shadows of travelers who have not yet been born, who will walk roads not yet built, who will arrive centuries from now to find the innkeeper still smiling, still preparing their rooms, still drawing water from a well that never runs dry. Or perhaps time folded the inn away entirely, tucking it into a crease we will never find, where it serves guests who exist only as shadows, only as possibilities, only as the faint potential of arrival, where memory fades, even absence has shape. As night settles over the place where the inn once stood, or will stand, or eternally stands in some unreachable fold of time, you might imagine yourself approaching. You might see your own shadow fall across walls that are no longer there, cast by light that hasn't arrived yet. You might feel that strange doubling of presence, that sense of being both here and ahead of here, both now and later. The inn waits. Not behind us, where ruins usually rest, but ahead, where destinations hide. And somewhere on white walls that exist in a future we're walking toward, shadows are even now arriving, our shadows, cast by a sun that will shine tomorrow, announcing to an innkeeper who sees what is coming that we are on our way, that we have already arrived, that we are forever approaching the threshold where shadow and substance meet, where time folds back on itself, where the inn stands eternal in its patient present, preparing rooms for guests who are always coming, always expected, always just about to round the bend and find, at last, the shelter that has been waiting since before they knew they needed it. Some places do not disappear. They simply arrive later than we do. In one chronicle, written by a merchant who travelled the road in its prime, the garden appears at the 23rd mile, a sudden miracle of green in the desert's pale monotony. He describes it as modest in size, enclosed by low walls of stacked stone, its interior shadowed by trees he could not name, their leaves silver grey and trembling in the slightest breeze. In another account, penned by a pilgrim decades later, the garden is found at the 41st mile. She writes of the same silver grey trees, the same low walls, but the location has shifted, moved, impossibly, nearly 20 miles from where the merchant placed it. A third text, a military report filed by a garrison commander, mentions discovering the garden at the 57th mile. His description matches the others. The same trees, the same careful enclosure, the same sense of stepping out of the desert's harshness into a pocket of entirely different air. 3 gardens, then. 3 separate oases along the vanished road, or perhaps only one. It is said that the garden did not stay in place, but walked. Not quickly. Nothing about this story suggests haste. But over years, across seasons, the garden migrated along the road's length, like a slow tide following something invisible. Something the keepers alone could sense, and the rest of us can only imagine. Whispers tell us the garden was tended by an order of silent keepers. They took no vow of silence. Their muteness was not discipline, but devotion. They believed that plants spoke in frequencies human voices would drown out, that the subtle languages of root and leaf required listeners who had surrendered speech. So they learned to communicate through gesture and expression, through the placement of their hands and the angles of their bodies, through everything except words. They lived simply, these keepers. A small dwelling stood at the garden's edge, barely more than a shelter, 4 walls and a roof. A place to sleep when sleep was needed. They owned little, wore simple cloth, ate sparingly from what the garden provided, and what travellers sometimes offered in gratitude or wonder. Their true wealth was knowledge. Knowledge of seeds. They collected them from every caravan that passed, from every merchant willing to trade, from every pilgrim who had carried something green across the long miles. Seeds from mountain valleys and coastal plains, from forests that never saw drought and marshlands that never fully dried. Each seed was studied, its shape memorized, its weight considered, its demands intuited. But the keepers understood something others did not, that seeds were not merely blueprints for plants, but compasses pointing towards specific conditions. Each seed carried within itself not just the memory of what it could become, but a longing for where it should become it. A certain tree required dawn light that struck at a particular angle. A certain herb needed soil that held moisture in a specific way. A certain flower demanded wind that came from the south in spring and the north in autumn, shifting its allegiance with the seasons. These requirements were not preferences, they were necessities, written into the very essence of each plant, as surely as leaves and roots were written into seeds. Where memory fades in most gardeners, who plant where they stand and hope for growth, these keepers planted where the plants themselves whispered they should be. Beneath the silence they listened. The land, the keepers believed, was not uniform. It seemed so, yes. The same pale sand, the same scattered rock, the same relentless sky. But beneath the apparent sameness, invisible currents flowed. Lines of force, they called them, or sometimes lines of favor. Corridors where certain energies gathered, where certain qualities of light or moisture or soil composition created narrow bands of possibility. These lines moved, not randomly, but according to patterns the keepers studied across generations. A line that favored silver-grey trees might shift northward over decades, following some deep rhythm in the earth's turning, some subtle change in the angle of sun or the direction of prevailing winds. And when the line moved, the garden had to move with it, or die. So every 7 years, perhaps 8, perhaps 6, depending on what their observations told them, the keepers would begin the great work of migration. We watch now as they prepare, these silent figures moving through their garden with careful deliberation. The trees are approached first, the oldest and most sacred. Their roots run deep, having drunk from underground sources for years. To simply cut and replant them would be murder. So instead the keepers dig around each trunk, exposing the root system in widening circles, taking days for each tree, working with small tools and patient hands. When enough root is visible, they wrap it, Not quickly, not roughly, but with strips of cloth that have been soaked in water mixed with certain minerals, certain extracts from other plants. The wrapped roots are then surrounded by the tree's own soil, gathered carefully and bound around the root ball with woven cordage. The trees stand partially excavated for days, adjusting to their new exposure, learning they are about to travel. The herbs come next, lifted in smaller bundles, each one keeping its earth intact round its roots like a memory of home. Some are bundled together, their roots intertwined in ways the keepers know will help them survive the journey. Others are separated, given space, understanding that certain plants cannot bear proximity during travel, even if they thrive as neighbors when rooted. Finally, the walls themselves are dismantled, stone by stone. Each stone is marked with a small charcoal sign, its position noted, its relationship to other stones remembered. The keepers understand that even walls have patterns, that stones placed randomly will not hold the same protective quality as stones arranged according to specific principles. When everything is ready, trees wrapped and bound, herbs bundled, stones marked, seeds pouched in careful containers, the keepers simply begin walking. Northward, almost always northward, though the texts disagree on whether this was consistent or merely predominant. They carry what can be carried, drag what must be dragged. The trees, wrapped and precious, are transported on simple sledges, pulled by animals borrowed from passing caravans, or sometimes by the keepers themselves, harnessed like oxen to their sacred cargo. The migration takes weeks. They move slowly, stopping frequently to check the plants, to adjust wrappings, and to whisper, without sound, only through touch, their reassurances to roots that are experiencing displacement for the first time in years. At night, the wrapped trees are unwrapped slightly, allowed to breathe, their roots dampened with carefully hoarded water. The herbs are laid out in patterns that mimic how they grew, given a temporary sense of place even in transit. And all the while, the keepers are reading the land they pass through, watching for signs that others would miss. The way morning light falls on a particular stretch of ground, the quality of sand in a certain area, not just its color, but its weight, its moisture, the way it runs through fingers, the presence of certain insects, certain birds, certain patterns of wind ripple on dune faces. They are searching for the place, the new place where the invisible lines have moved, where the conditions have shifted into alignment, where the garden will be not displaced but restored, planted not where it was but where it needs to be. It might take 100 miles of walking before they find it. It might take only 20, but when they arrive they know. The keepers feel it before they see it. Some collective recognition that passes between them in glances and small gestures. Here, this place, these few acres that look no different from the thousands they have passed, this is where the garden must root. And so they rebuild, the walls rise again, stones placed according to the marks, the pattern preserved. The trees are planted in new earth that smells different, feels different, but satisfies some requirement the old earth had begun to lose. The herbs are arranged not as they were, but as they need to be in this new configuration of sun and wind. The seeds, finally, are scattered or planted with the same care given to ancient scripture. Where memory fades in place, it finds renewal in migration. For a time, 7 years, perhaps 8, the garden thrives in its new location. Travelers find it along the road and marvel at its existence. Its improbable green defying the desert's harsh decrees. They rest in its shade, drink from the well the keepers maintain, receive small gifts of herbs or fruit, given freely, without price, without expectation. The merchants and pilgrims note its location in their journals, mark it on their maps. But when they return years later, following the same road, checking the same mile markers, they find empty sand where the garden stood. Their maps suddenly are wrong. Their memories are contradicted by the land's refusal to cooperate. Some assume they miscounted the miles, misread the markers. Others believe the desert has erased it, buried it beneath fresh dunes. But a few, the observant ones, the ones who had spoken with the keepers through gesture and intuition, understand what has really happened. The garden has not died. It has walked. It has followed the invisible lines only it was meant to follow, migrating to wherever the conditions of its existence have shifted. Then the road itself began to fade. The cities it connected entered their long decline. The caravans thinned. The markers fell or were buried. And the garden, having walked northward for generations, perhaps centuries, reached the road's end, the place where the pale stone stopped, and only unmarked desert stretched ahead. It is said the keepers made one final migration, beyond the road's terminus, past the last mile marker, into territory no map recorded and no chronicle named. They carried their trees and herbs and sacred seeds into a place that existed only in the land's deep language, only in the invisible currents they had spent lifetimes learning to read. Some believe they are there still, or their descendants are, silent figures, tending a garden that moves across regions we have not named, following lines we have not drawn, reading a text written in soil and starlight that predates human writing and will outlast it. Others say the garden dissolved, the keepers scattered, the knowledge lost. But sometimes, travelers crossing the desert far from any road report strange findings. A single tree growing where no tree should survive. Its leaves silver grey and trembling. A patch of herbs clustered impossibly around a hidden seep. Seeds that appear in the sand after storms. Foreign seeds. Impossible seeds. As if scattered by hands that no longer exist. Or perhaps by hands that exist outside the boundaries we recognize as present. Beneath the silence, the garden may still be walking. Not for us to find, but for itself, following its own necessities, its own slow calendar, its own pilgrimage toward conditions only it understands. Where memory fades in location, it persists in motion. As the night deepens and your thoughts begin their own migration towards sleep, you might imagine those silent keepers still moving across vast distances, carrying wrapped roots and bundled herbs, reading the land's secret languages, planting in places we will never map because they refuse to stay still long enough to be drawn. The garden walks, the keepers listen, and somewhere in the desert, or beyond it, in mountains or valleys we have not yet learned to see, silver-grey trees are taking root again, herbs are spreading their familiar patterns, and seeds are falling into soil that has been waiting, perhaps for centuries, to receive exactly these plants, in exactly this configuration, in exactly this moment. The garden always arriving where it needs to be, never where we expect it, always where the invisible lines have led, walking north or east, or into dimensions that have no directions, following the ancient paths that only growing things can sense, teaching us, if we listen, that the deepest roots are the ones that know when to let go, that the truest gardens are the ones that refuse to be fixed, and that sometimes the most sacred act is not staying where you were planted, but learning to read the earth's subtle signs and walking. When the time comes, toward wherever life waits to bloom again, far below the surface of the ocean, where the light of day fades into an eternal twilight, there lies a temple. An ancient structure that once rose from the deep like a celestial gate, its towering walls reaching toward the stars. This temple, though now lost beneath the waves, was once a place of great power, built by a civilization that understood the secret language of the stars. The gate itself, a magnificent arch carved from coral and stone, was believed to be a doorway, a passage between the earthly realm and the divine. Now its once glorious form is buried beneath the ocean's embrace, swallowed by the deep, but its memory still lingers, echoing in the silent waters. The journey begins beneath the tranquil surface of the sea, where the ocean, though calm, holds the weight of its ancient secrets. The water is cool, the current gentle, and the sunlight that filters down from above is soft, casting everything in shades of pale blue and silver. As you descend further into the depths, the world above fades into a distant memory, and the silence grows deeper, more profound. The sounds of the world are muffled here, replaced by the soft hum of the water and the distant rhythm of the earth's heartbeat. With each passing moment, you draw closer to the sunken temple, your path guided by the faintest shimmer of moonlight that dances upon the ocean floor. It is said that the temple, built long ago by a people who believed in the sacred connection between the stars and the ocean, was designed to align with the cosmos. The celestial gate, though now broken and submerged, was once a majestic structure that stood as a beacon, a symbol of divine unity. The people who built this temple were not merely astrologers or priests, but sacred keepers, chosen to interpret the movements of the stars and bring the wisdom of the heavens down to the earth. Their connection to the stars was not one of worship, but of understanding. They believed that through the celestial gate, they could commune with the gods and bring divine knowledge to their people. As you approach the sunken ruins, the first thing you notice is the faint outline of the gate. its once mighty arches now partially buried beneath a blanket of sand and coral. The stone, though weathered by centuries of salt water, still holds its shape, still reflects the faintest glimmer of light. The ocean, though vast and ancient, feels intimate here, as though it is sharing a secret, holding a memory that it is not ready to forget. The gate, though cracked and broken, still speaks of a time when it was whole, when it stood tall above the waves, a connection between the divine and the earthly. Inside the ruins, the temple is almost entirely reclaimed by the sea. The once grand hallways are now filled with seaweed and coral, the stone floors smooth from the constant ebb and flow of water. Yet despite the temple's age, there is still something sacred about this place, something that hums in the stillness of the water. The faintest glow can be seen in the crevices of the stone, a soft light that seems to pulse from deep within the walls, as if the temple itself is still alive, still waiting for the return of the divine connection it once held. The air is thick with the scent of salt and ancient stone, and though the water is silent, there is an energy here, an unspoken presence, like the temple is breathing, waiting. As you explore deeper into the ruins, the walls are covered with intricate carvings of celestial bodies. Stars, moons, planets, their patterns still visible, though faded by time. Some of the carvings depict gods and goddesses, their hands raised toward the sky, their bodies intertwined with the cosmos. Others show ships sailing upon the ocean, their sails filled with the wind, their course determined by the movements of the stars above. The people who built this temple understood the connection between the earth and the heavens. They knew that the ocean, like the stars, was a living force, and that both held the power to guide them toward their destiny. But now, the temple lies silent, its once proud walls crumbling beneath the weight of centuries. The celestial gate, though still standing, is barely recognizable, its once vibrant carvings worn by the unrelenting touch of the ocean. What happened to the people who built this temple? What caused them to vanish, leaving the temple to fall into ruin? Some believe that the temple was destroyed by a great storm, that the gods themselves withdrew their favor, leaving the people to face the wrath of the ocean. Others whisper that the kingdom simply faded, its people lost to time, their knowledge and wisdom swallowed by the deep. But there are those who believe that the temple sank of its own accord, that it was never meant to remain in the world, that its purpose was always to be a moment in time, a fleeting connection between the divine and the earthly. As you stand beneath the celestial gate, the water around you feels heavier, as though the ocean is holding its breath. The silence grows deeper, more profound, and you begin to feel the weight of the temple's history pressing in on you, its secrets waiting to be revealed. Perhaps the temple was never meant to be found again, but only to be felt, its presence woven into the very fabric of the ocean, its wisdom carried in the current, in the rhythm of the tides. Perhaps the celestial gate, though broken, still stands, waiting for someone to understand it, to listen to the whispers of the stars and the ocean, to reconnect the divine and the earthly. as the journey through the temple fades into the silence of the sea, you are left with the lingering sense that some things are not meant to be fully understood, but only experienced, felt in the stillness, in the space between those waves, in the ancient rhythm of the water. The celestial gate may be lost, its path forgotten, but the wisdom of the temple, like the stars themselves, still echoes in the depths, waiting for someone to listen. Perhaps the temple's purpose was not to provide answers, but to teach us how to seek, how to listen, how to connect. And as you leave the sunken ruins behind, the ocean hums softly, carrying its secret, its divine wisdom into the deep. Some voices only echo when we are ready to hear them, and the celestial gate, though lost to the ocean, continues to speak in the language of the stars. Deep within the heart of an ancient forest, where the light of the sun scarcely touches the moss-covered ground, there lies a temple, not of grandiose spires or towering walls, but of quiet, enduring stone, long worn by the passage of time. Its pillars, once strong and proud, now stand like sentinels in a forgotten world, their forms softened by the encroaching ivy and the slow, patient hand of nature. The temple is not a place of ruin, but of sacred silence, where the gods were once believed to walk, and the earth itself seemed to pulse with the divine. Now, the temple's story is a whisper carried on the wind, its sacred halls empty, its echoes fading beneath the weight of forgotten millennia. The journey begins beneath the cool shadowed canopy, where the air feels thick with the earth's memory, where every leaf, every stone seems to hold a secret. The ground beneath your feet is soft, the scent of damp moss and ancient wood filling your senses. The forest is alive, but it is a quiet life, one that does not speak loudly, but hums beneath the surface, in the movement of roots, in the sway of branches, in the silence of the undergrowth. Each step you take feels like a journey deeper into the heart of time, as though the trees themselves are guiding you, pulling you towards something ancient, something sacred. It is said that this temple was built long ago by a civilization that revered the earth and its gods, a people whose connection to the divine was not rooted in words or rituals, but in silence, in the quiet reverence of the natural world. They believed that the gods were not separate from nature, but part of it, woven into the very fabric of the earth, the sky, and the stars. The temple, though humble in its design, was constructed to honor these gods, to serve as a place where the earthly and the divine could meet in stillness. Its pillars, though now weathered, once stood tall, each one representing a sacred force. The sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, each one carrying the divine energy of the cosmos. As you approach the temple, the forest seems to open, the trees parting to reveal the stone pillars that rise before you, standing like ancient sentinels, guarding a secret, a memory. The stone is cracked and worn, but it still holds its shape, its sacredness. The carvings that once adorned the pillars are faded, nearly erased by the touch of centuries. But faint traces remain. Patterns of stars, moons, and celestial beings, their forms worn by time, but still carrying the essence of what they once represented. The pillars stand not as remnants of a long-dead civilization, but as living entities, as though they still hold the memory of the prayers that were once offered here, the reverence that once filled this space. The temple is empty now, but it was not always so. It is said that those who entered the temple did so in silence, seeking communion with the gods in a way that transcended words. There were no grand ceremonies, no loud chants, but instead a quiet stillness that filled the air, a stillness that allowed the divine to be felt, not heard. The altar, though now dusted with the earth of centuries, once held offerings of stone, wood, and flame. Gifts given in reverence, not for power, but for connection. The gods, it was believed, did not require worship in the traditional sense, but instead sought the quiet devotion of hearts open to the divine presence in all things. As you step inside the temple, the silence deepens. The pillars, though broken in places, still stand tall and proud, as though they are waiting for something, for someone to return, for the gods to walk the earth once more. The air is thick with the weight of the past, yet there is a quiet peace here. A peace that speaks not of loss, but of completion. The temple, though abandoned, still feels alive with the energy of those who once revered it. The stones seem to hum with memory, with the echo of footsteps long since faded, with the pulse of a divine presence that has not fully left this place. Some believe that the temple's purpose was never to be fully understood. Perhaps it was always meant to serve as a reminder that the divine does not always speak in words or grand rituals, but in the quiet spaces between, in the stillness of the heart, in the reverence for the world as it is. The gods, it is said, walk among us still, not in the grand temples or the high places, but in the small moments of stillness, in the quiet connection between earth and sky. The pillars, though broken, still stand as silent witnesses to this truth, as if they are waiting for the world to remember, for the gods to walk once more in the stillness. Perhaps the temple was never meant to be discovered again, not in the way we think. Perhaps its true purpose was to be a place of remembrance, of connection, a space where the silence between the divine and the earthly could be felt. And perhaps, like the gods themselves, the temple remains hidden, waiting for the world to be ready to listen. Some mysteries, it seems, are not meant to be fully uncovered, but only experienced in the quiet moments when the heart is open, when the earth and the sky are in harmony. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows over the temple's silent pillars, you step away from the sacred space. The air is still, but now it feels different, lighter, as though the earth itself has exhaled, as though the silence has spoken in a way that words cannot. The temple remains, hidden in the forest, its memory carried on the wind, waiting for the world to remember, for someone to listen. Some voices only echo, when we are ready to hear them. And the silent pillars of this forgotten temple wait patiently for the moment when the world will once again be ready to listen. At the road's highest point, where the land rises into a gentle ridge and the view should stretch for miles in every direction, a tower once stood. It was not tall, perhaps 3 times the height of a person, modest by the standards of fortifications, humble compared to the great towers that marked important cities. But its placement was precise, deliberate, as if those who built it understood that height alone does not determine what can be seen. The tower was round, its walls built from stones fitted so carefully that mortar was barely needed, each block bearing the weight above it with patient resignation. A single doorway opened at ground level, narrow enough that entering required turning slightly sideways, bowing the head. No other openings broke the exterior wall, no arrow slits, no lookout positions. No windows gazing outward toward the horizons where danger might gather. All the windows faced inward. They opened not to the world beyond the tower, but to the tower's own central chamber. A circular hollow that ran from floor to ceiling like a throat, like a well dug upward into sky instead of downward into earth. Around this hollow, a narrow ledge spiraled upward, a walkway that climbed the inner wall in a slow helix, allowing those inside to ascend while keeping their gaze fixed on the chamber's heart. It is said this design was not accident, but intention, not flaw, but purpose. Whispers tell us the tower was built by an empire that understood surveillance differently than most. That watching for them was not merely about seeing what approached from outside, but about observing what moved within the tower, within the watchers themselves, within the subtle atmosphere that precedes events before events become visible. The gods who were stationed here learned this quickly. They would arrive expecting traditional duty, scanning horizons for dust clouds that meant caravans or armies, tracking the movement of travelers along the road, noting who came and went and from which direction. They would climb to the tower's interior, ready to peer outward from elevated positions. And they would find there was nothing to peer from, only the inner chamber, the hollow heart, the circular void around which the walkway spiraled. Only windows that looked at emptiness, at the space contained within stone walls, at shadows and air, and the slow progression of light across surfaces that should have been unremarkable. At first, the gods assumed this was some kind of punishment, some cruel joke. They would stand on the walkway, frustrated, trying to see through the narrow doorway to the world beyond, forced to descend and step outside whenever they wished to actually observe and observe anything. But then, slowly, they began to notice something. The inner chamber was not empty, or rather, it was empty of objects, but not empty of presence. Beneath the silence, the tower watched itself. Shadows moved across the inner walls that had no obvious source. In the morning, when the sun should have cast clean, predictable shapes through the inward-facing windows, strange patterns would appear instead. Angular forms that resembled human figures, or sometimes animals, or sometimes geometries that belonged to nothing in the visible world. These shadows would drift slowly across the curved surface, pausing in certain places, lingering as if drawn to specific stones, then moving on without cause the guards could identify. Light behaved strangely here as well. Sometimes the chamber would brighten without corresponding changes in the sun's position. Sometimes darkness would deepen in corners that should have been illuminated. The air itself seemed to hold luminosity unevenly, creating bands and gradients that shifted according to rhythms the guards could not predict. And then there were the sounds. Whispers, perhaps, or echoes of whispers, or the memory of voices that had never quite spoken, but had wanted to, had formed words in throats that chose silence, and those unspoken words had somehow collected here, in this chamber, designed to observe inward, replaying themselves in frequencies just below hearing. The guards began to watch, not the horizons beyond the tower, but the tower's heart, not what approached from outside, but what moved within. They would station themselves on the spiral walkway, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, and simply observe the chamber's interior as if it were a landscape, as if shadows and light were geography enough. And they began to report things, but not the things watchtowers usually report. No approaching caravans, no gathering armies, no movements of merchants or migration of peoples. Instead, their messages spoke of subtler observations, a restlessness in the southern shadows today, as if something unresolved gathers there. The light pools in the upper chamber with unusual weight. Expect decisions from the capital to arrive heavy with consequence. The air between the third and fourth windows holds a trembling. Watch for news that will require careful response. The Empire's officials who received these messages were initially baffled. They had stationed guards in the tower to watch the road, to report on tangible, useful information, who travelled, how many, carrying what. These vague observations about shadows and trembling air seemed like madness, or poetry, or perhaps both. But over time, a pattern emerged. The shadow that gathered in the southern walls would be followed, days or weeks later, by tensions with southern provinces, disputes over taxes, arguments about boundaries, the kind of friction that could ignite into conflict if not carefully managed. The heavy light in the upper chamber preceded messages from the capital that were indeed weighted with difficulty. New laws that would prove unpopular, appointments that would cause resentment, decisions that carried consequences the decision-makers had not fully considered. The trembling air announced, with uncanny reliability, news that would require delicate handling, deaths of important figures, shifts in alliances, changes in trade agreements that would ripple through the empire's economy. Where memory fades in certainty, intuition sharpens. The tower, it seemed, did not watch for events. It watched for the atmosphere of events, the mood that precedes action, the subtle shifts in the empire's fabric that happened before anything visible occurred. And those stationed within it, forced to turn their gaze inward rather than outward, learned to read these signs, not through logic or analysis, but through a kind of sustained attention that borders on meditation. Generations of guards passed through the tower. Some served only briefly, unable to adapt to the strange duty. uncomfortable with watching emptiness, frustrated by the lack of tangible purpose. But others stayed for years, even decades, ascending and descending the spiral walkway like monks following a prayer, their eyes growing increasingly attuned to the chamber's subtle language. These long-term watchers developed reputations. They would send messages that seemed cryptic but proved prescient. They would warn of approaching moods, not approaching armies, but approaching sadness, approaching anger, approaching the kind of collective restlessness that precedes social upheaval. And their warnings were rarely wrong. It is said that the tower functioned as a kind of inner eye for the empire, complementing the outer eyes of border patrols and coastal watchers. While others reported what was, the tower reported what was becoming. The invisible currents that would eventually surface as events. The underground rivers that would eventually break through as springs. But as with all things, time worked its changes. The road began its slow dissolution. The cities it connected entered their decline. The empire that had built the tower started to fray at its edges, then deeper, tensions multiplying, trust eroding, the fabric that had held everything together beginning to show its age. The gods in the tower reported these changes long before they became obvious. The shadows no longer drift but fragment. Watch for fracturing. The light pools in isolated patches now. Unity is becoming harder to maintain. The chamber's air holds no coherence. We are becoming multiple where we were once singular. These messages arrived at a capital less and less able to receive them, less and less interested in subtle warnings about mood and atmosphere. The officials wanted reports about troop movements, about threats they could see and count and address with traditional means. The tower's cryptic observations about shadows and light began to seem like relics of a different age, a different way of understanding that no longer served. The last god stationed in the tower, an old man who had spent nearly his entire life there, who knew the chamber's moods the way one knows the face of a beloved, sent a final message. It wasn't written in words. It was a drawing, a simple sketch of the tower itself, rendered with careful attention to each stone, each window, each turn of the spiral walkway. But in the drawing, the stones were not touching. They floated, separated by small gaps, each one maintaining its position relative to the others, but no longer connected, no longer bearing each other's weight, no longer functioning as a unified structure. The tower drawn as it was becoming, still present, still shaped, but held together now only by memory rather than mortar, by the idea of itself rather than the reality. Shortly after this message arrived, travelers passing the ridge reported the tower empty. The door stood open. The interior was abandoned. No sign of the guard remained. No bedding, no tools. No evidence of the decades he had spent watching shadows and light in the hollow heart. But outside, in a careful spiral on the ground, the tower's stones lay arranged, not scattered as if by collapse, not tumbled as if by earthquake, but placed, deliberately positioned in a pattern that echoed the spiral walkway within, each stone at a specific distance from its neighbors, the whole forming a flat constellation on the earth. The tower had disassembled itself, or rather, the last guard had disassembled it, carefully, reverently teaching the structure how to lie down rather than fall down, showing it how to become a pattern on the ground rather than a ruin against the sky. Beneath the silence, a teaching remained. Perhaps the tower's final lesson was this: that true watching is not outward but inward, that the most important observations are not of what approaches from the horizon, but of what stirs in the heart. That surveillance of the external world means little if we cannot also watch the subtle movements within our structures, within our communities, within ourselves. The stones lie in their spiral still, or so it is said. Travelers who find them sometimes sit in their center, in the space where the tower's hollow heart once opened to sky. And they report, those who linger there in quiet contemplation, a strange clarity, not about external circumstances, not about practical matters of road and destination, but about interior landscapes, tensions they had been carrying unacknowledged, decisions they had been avoiding, truths they had been unwilling to observe. The tower still watches, not as walls and windows, but as pattern and possibility, as a reminder that the most important watchtowers are the ones we build inside ourselves, the ones that turn their gaze inward rather than outward, that learn to read the shadows of approaching moods before they become actions, that understand trembling in the air as a language worth learning. Where memory fades in stone, it persists in practice. As the night deepens and your own inner watchtower begins its quiet vigil, you might feel your attention turning inward, watching not what approaches from tomorrow, but what stirs in the chamber of now. What shadows move across your inner walls? What light pools in unexpected places? What trembling in your own air suggests changes gathering, moods forming, the kind of interior weather that precedes all our visible actions? The tower that saw only inward taught us to watch truly, not by looking harder at the world outside, but by learning to see what lives in the space between our stones, in the hollow heart where shadows drift and light pools and whispers echo, where we can learn to read our own becoming before it becomes, where the most important surveillance is the gentle watching of our own interior landscape, observing with patience and without judgment the patterns that form, the moods that gather, the slow spiral of our own unfolding, seen best when we finally turn our gaze not outward toward horizons, but inward toward the heart, where everything we need to watch has always waited to be witnessed. Along the road's southern stretch, where the land begins to rise toward distant hills and the air tastes faintly of stone and ancient rain, travelers would sometimes pause at a particular outcrop of rock. There was no marker to indicate its significance, no inscription carved into its face, no cairn built nearby, no pilgrim's shrine to suggest this place mattered more than any other stretch of desert. The outcrop simply rose from the earth, a dark mass of layered stone, perhaps twice the height of a person, its surface weathered into curves and hollows. its face turned toward the road like a listener waiting for speech. Yet, multiple accounts mention it. A merchant's journal from one century, a pilgrim's letter from another, a soldier's report from a third. They come from different times, different kingdoms, different purposes for traveling the road. But they describe the same phenomenon with the same mixture of wonder and unease. At this outcrop, echoes did not behave as echoes should. Speak a word, any word, and the stone would return it, but not as you had spoken it. The sound that came back was recognizable as your voice, carried your particular tone and rhythm, yet the words themselves had changed, transformed, translated into something older, something that predated the language you had used, something that felt less like translation and more like revelation. It is said that a merchant, stopping to rest his animals near the outcrop, called out a greeting to his companions. A simple phrase in the language of trade and caravans. Words he had spoken 10,000 times without thought. What returned to him was not his greeting. It was something else. Syllables that seemed to predate syllables. Sounds that belonged to a time when human mouths were still learning to shape meaning from breath. He understood it, though he had never heard these sounds before. The meaning arrived not through his ears but through something deeper, some older listening that lived beneath the surface of language. His greeting had been returned to him in its original form, before it became the words he knew, before those words descended from older words, which descended from older words still, all the way back to the first sound a human throat made that meant, "I see you," or "I am here," or simply, "We exist together in this moment." Beneath the silence, the stone remembered. Others reported similar experiences, though with variations that suggested the outcrop's gift was not consistent, not predictable, not something that could be studied and catalogued and understood through the usual methods of inquiry. A linguist came once, it is said, a scholar whose life was devoted to tracing languages backward through time, mapping their evolution, their branches and convergences, their slow transformations across centuries and migrations. He had heard rumors of the speaking stone and came prepared with tools, wax tablets to record sounds, notations to capture phonetics, a mind trained to analyze and categorize. He stood before the outcrop and spoke a carefully chosen word. A word in his own language that he had traced back through 6 earlier forms. A word whose history he knew better than he knew his own lineage. Nothing came back. The stone absorbed his word and returned only silence, as if it had not been spoken at all, as if the outcrop had decided his listening was not ready. His hearing still trapped in analysis rather than open to recognition. He tried again. Different words, different tones, different times of day. Sometimes the echo came, but not always translated. Sometimes merely repeated. Sometimes offering back his exact phrase in a way that felt almost mocking, as if the stone was saying, "You speak, but do not listen. You hear, but do not understand." Other times, when he spoke without intention, without preparation, muttering to himself in frustration, whispering a prayer he had learned as a child, the translation would come. The old syllables would return. carrying his meaning in a form so ancient it had no alphabet, no written expression, only sound, shaped by need and breath, and the desperate human attempt to make connection across the void of separateness. Where memory fades in scholarship, it awakens in surrender. But the most consistent reports came from those who did not try to study the phenomenon, who simply accepted it as another mystery in a world full of mysteries, who spoke to the outcrop not to receive translation, but simply because speaking near stone seemed natural, seemed right, seemed like the thing one does when words need to be said, and no human ear is near enough to receive them. These travelers, the merchants and pilgrims, the wanderers and refugees, those passing through on journeys both external and internal, would rest near the outcrop and speak their thoughts aloud, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in confession, sometimes simply naming their fears or hopes, or the particular loneliness that comes from traveling long roads away from the known. And the stone would answer them in the old tongue, not immediately always. Sometimes the echo came after a delay, long enough that they had already turned away, already begun to walk, already started to forget what they had said. Then the words would arrive from behind, in that ancient language that was somehow their language, their meaning returned to them in its truest form. They described it as recognition rather than translation, as if the words they had spoken in their current language were merely approximations of deeper truths. And the outcrop was revealing those truths, stripping away the centuries of linguistic evolution to show what lived beneath. I am afraid became something that meant both fear and courage, both trembling and standing firm, both the sensation of danger and the determination to continue anyway, all contained in a single sound that created the need to separate these things into distinct concepts. I am lost, returned as something that held both disorientation and discovery, both the absence of clear path and the possibility of finding new paths, both confusion and the kind of openness that confusion creates. The outcrop was not translating their words so much as completing them, showing them what their words had always meant beneath the simple meanings they thought they carried. Whispers tell us the stone itself was not creating this effect, but revealing it. That language, all language, rests on older strata of meaning, like sediment rests on bedrock. That beneath every word we speak lies an older word, and beneath that an older word still, and beneath that a sound that is almost not sound, almost pre-verbal, almost the pure intention that existed before mouths learned to shape it into specific phonemes. And certain places, certain formations of stone and space and acoustic geometry allow that deeper layer to break through, not by adding something to our words, but by peeling away the accumulated centuries, by showing us what we were always saying beneath what we thought we were saying. We drift closer to the outcrop now, in imagination alone, studying its surface. The stone is dark, but not uniform. Layers run through it at angles, evidence of its formation deep beneath the earth, under pressure, then its slow rise to the surface, then its long weathering under wind and rare rain. These layers create natural chambers within the rock, cavities and cracks and passages too narrow for anything but air and sound to enter. Perhaps it is these interior spaces that hold the outcrop's gift. Perhaps sound enters them and travels through passages that wind deeper than any eye can follow, bouncing off walls at angles that strip away everything recent, everything evolved, everything except the original intention. Perhaps by the time the sound emerges again, it has shed all its contemporary clothing and stands naked in its oldest form. Or perhaps the stone contains something else. Memories of the first humans who passed this way, who spoke the earliest versions of language, whose words were recorded not in writing, but in vibration, in subtle changes to the stone's molecular structure, in frequencies trapped within crystal matrices, waiting for other sounds to release them. Beneath the silence, all speaking is layered. As the road began its dissolution, as the cities it connected faded, and the travelers grew fewer, the outcrop's gift may have changed as well. Some say it still functions, that the stone still translates, still reveals the oldest forms of meaning. But finding it has become difficult. The road that once led directly past it has vanished. The landmarks that once made it findable, certain shaped dunes, particular arrangements of smaller rocks, have shifted or disappeared. Now the outcrop can be reached only by those who arrive without maps, without directions, without expectations. Those who wander guided by something other than geography. Those whose listening has already begun before they arrive, whose ears are already attuned to older frequencies, whose willingness to hear what they say in its truest form has already opened channels the rest of us keep closed. Perhaps this was always the requirement. Perhaps the outcrop never translated words for the curious or the analytical, never performed for those who came to witness a phenomenon. Perhaps it only ever spoke to those who were already listening in the right way, with surrender rather than study, with openness rather than method, with the kind of hearing that happens not in the ears, but in the chest, the belly, the bones, where memory fades in location, persists in intention. As evening settles over the place where the outcrop stands, or stood, or will stand again when found by the right kind of seeker, you might imagine yourself there, not trying to find it on a map or following written directions, but simply arriving the way dreams arrive, the way understanding sometimes comes unbidden. You speak a word into the growing darkness, any word, the word that lives closest to the surface of your thoughts tonight, the word you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. The word that names what you most need to name right now, even if you do not consciously know what that is. And you wait, not with expectation, not with analysis, not wondering if the echo will come or what form it will take, but with simple openness, the way a canyon waits for rain, the way stone waits for sun, the way the oldest parts of a beast wait for recognition. Perhaps the echo comes. Perhaps it returns your word in that ancient tongue, in syllables that feel like coming home, like remembering something you never learned, like hearing your own truth spoken in the language that was always underneath the language, that will outlast all the languages we currently speak, that connects us backward to the first humans who stood upright and forward to whatever we will become. Or perhaps the echo is simply silence, but a silence that somehow completes your word, that shows you what your speaking meant beneath what you thought you were saying. The outcrop waits, not for voices, but for the willingness to hear what voices become when stripped of everything except their original intention. Not for words, but for the courage to receive those words back in forms we may not recognize, but will somehow impossibly understand. Translation is not about words, the stone teaches us. It is about readiness. The willingness to hear ourselves echoed back in truth rather than repetition, in origin rather than evolution, in the language that was before language, that is beneath language, that will be after language when all our current words have aged into silence and only the oldest sounds remain, echoing through stone and time and the caverns of our own listening, waiting for us to finally hear what we have been saying all along. In the empire's archives, among the carefully rolled parchments and bound codices, among the star charts and water maps and boundary drawings, there worked a cartographer whose name has been reduced to a single letter in the few records that remain. M, just M, as if even her name was being slowly erased by the same forces that shaped her work, that taught her the most important truths sometimes require subtraction rather than addition. She was, by all accounts, obsessed with accuracy, but not the simple accuracy of measurement, not the mechanical precision of counting paces and calculating angles. She sought something deeper, the accuracy of truth, the precision of reality as it was lived rather than as it had been built. When the empire's officials commissioned her to create the definitive map of the road, the pale ribbon of stone that connected cities now fading, that bore backward counting milestones toward destinations no longer reached, she accepted with a condition that must have seemed strange to them. She would walk the entire road herself, not once, quickly, but slowly, over however long it took. She would carry blank parchment and measuring tools, yes, but also questions. She would draw what she found, but only after understanding what she was finding. The map would be complete when it was honest, and honest only when it reflected not what had been but what was. They agreed, perhaps not understanding what they were agreeing to. It is said she began her journey on the first day of spring, when the desert had softened from winter's cold but not yet hardened into summer's fury. She carried little. Her parchment rolled tight, her measuring cord, her pens and ink, a water skin, and a small journal bound in leather that had once been blue but had faded to the color of forgotten sky. In this journal, she would record not measurements, but observations, not distances, but encounters, not geography, but life. The first days were simple. The road near the capital was still maintained, still used, still alive with purpose. Caravans passed her regularly. Merchants nodded in greeting. The stones beneath her feet were swept clean by passing traffic, their edges sharp, their arrangement intact. She drew these sections with confidence, her pen moving across parchment in lines that declared, "Here the road exists. Here it functions. Here it matters." But as she walked further from the capital, things began to change. The traffic thinned. Days passed between caravans. The stones, no longer kept clean by constant passage, gathered dust in their joints. Small plants pushed through cracks that had widened in the absence of wheels and hooves to compress them. The road was still physically present. The stones still lay in their careful arrangement. But something else was missing. At each settlement she reached, she would stop and ask her questions. When did you last see a caravan pass? When did traders last stop here? When did you last need this road? The answers varied, but patterns emerged. In some places, people would speak of caravans from weeks ago, merchants who still followed the old route out of habit or loyalty. In others, the last caravan had passed months ago or a year or longer. And in still others, people would pause, thinking, then shake their heads. They could not remember. The road existed, stones visible beneath their feet, but no one walked it anymore. Other routes had opened. Different paths had proven easier, safer, more direct to places that now mattered more. Beneath the silence, Em began to understand. The road was dying, but not all at once. It was dying in sections, in discrete lengths, where use had stopped, where need had evaporated, where the stones remained but the road, the living, functioning road, had already departed. And so she made a decision that would define her work and ensure her dismissal. She began to erase. Not physically. The stones still lay where they had been placed. But on her map, she would leave gaps, blank spaces, places where the parchment showed nothing, as if the road simply ended, then began again, miles later, with emptiness between, where the people told her no one walked anymore. She drew nothing. Where the need had ceased, she left the parchment bare. Where the road existed only as stones without purpose, she marked it as absent. Her method was meticulous. At each settlement, each well, each landmark, she would ask her questions and listen carefully to the answers. She learned to read the pauses, the hesitations, the way people's eyes would drift when trying to remember the last caravan. She learned to distinguish between a road that was used rarely, but still vital, and a road that was avoided, bypassed, replaced by routes that better served the present rather than honoring the past. And she drew accordingly. The map that grew across her parchment became strange, unlike any map the Empire's archives had seen. The road did not run as a continuous line from capital to distant city. Instead, it appeared as fragments. A stretch here, a gap, another stretch there, another gap. Segments floating disconnected, like islands in a sea of blank parchment. Where memory fades in stone, it vanishes from maps. 3 years she walked, measuring not just distance but vitality, not just location but relevance. Her journal filled with notes that would have meant nothing to other cartographers, but everything to those who understood what she was attempting. Mile 43 to mile 51, stones present, road absent. Last use unknown. Local Welha Street settlement abandoned. No reason to pass this way remains. Mile 87 to mile 90, road lives. Weekly caravans. Merchants speak of this stretch with familiarity. Their feet know these stones. Mile 112 to mile 118. Stones worn but traffic ceased. New route established to the north, cutting 2 days from journey. This section exists only as history. The empire's officials, receiving occasional reports of her progress, grew concerned. They had commissioned a map of the road, not a map of where the road used to matter. They sent messages asking her to simply draw what was there. The physical presence of stones, the documented route, the engineered path regardless of whether anyone walked it. She sent back a single response. A road exists where it is walked, not where stones lie. They did not understand. How could stones arranged deliberately, maintained at great expense, engineered with precision and care, not constitute a road? How could something physically present be considered absent simply because people chose different paths? But Em had learned, in her 3 years of walking, that roads are not merely physical objects. They are agreements, collective decisions, that this path matters enough to maintain, to use, to remember. When that agreement dissolves, when the collective decision shifts, the physical stones remain. But the road itself has departed, has migrated to wherever the new agreement leads. Her map was honest in a way that made it unbearable to those who preferred the comfort of continuous lines, of certainty, of roads that stayed where they were, placed regardless of whether they were needed. When she finally returned to the capital and presented her work, the parchment covered in disconnected segments, the gaps between them speaking as loudly as the drawn sections, the officials rejected it immediately. "This is incomplete," they said. "This is not a map, but a collection of fragments. Where is the road between these sections? Where are the portions you have left out?" "They are gone," she told them. "They exist as stones, but not as road. To draw them would be to lie, to claim presence where only absence remains." "But we need a complete map," they insisted. "We need to know the entire route, every mile, every section." "Then you need to walk it as I walked it," she said quietly. "You need to see which stones still carry footsteps and which carry only emptiness. You need to understand that some things remain visible long after they cease to matter." They dismissed her work, paid her a reduced fee, filed her map among the curiosities and mistakes, the documents that failed to serve their intended purpose. But Em kept a copy. It is said that in her small room, in the years that followed her dismissal, she would unroll her map and study it. Not the drawn sections, but the gaps. The empty spaces where her pen had deliberately stayed lifted, where the parchment remained blank, where the road had been subtracted rather than added. She understood something the officials could not, that the gaps were as important as the lines, that what she had removed revealed the road's true shape more honestly than if she had drawn every stone. That truth sometimes requires erasure, that accuracy demands subtraction, that the most honest maps show not everything that exists, but only what lives. Beneath the silence, a philosophy formed, After her death, quiet, unremarked, in a room where maps covered every wall and blank parchment waited for journeys not yet taken, they found her map again. With it, a note written in her precise hand. A road exists where it is walked, not where stones lie. I have drawn what lives and left blank what remains. Future cartographers will think me incomplete. They will be correct. All honest maps are incomplete. Only lies achieve wholeness. The note was filed with the map, both stored in the archives where curiosities gather. But whispers suggest something else occurred. Something that cannot be verified in official records, but persists in the stories that archivists tell to each other in quiet corners. That M did not truly die. Or if she died, death did not stop her walking. That sometimes travelers crossing sections of the desert where the road once ran, but no longer matters, report seeing a figure in the distance, a woman walking slowly, carrying something under her arm, pausing occasionally as if measuring, as if marking, as if trying to understand the exact dimensions of absence, that she is still mapping, still walking. But now she walks only the gaps, only the blank sections, only the places she deliberately left off her parchment. She measures the distance between where the road was and where it mattered, calculating the space between physical presence and living purpose, charting the geography of what we have stopped maintaining. Where memory fades in official records, it persists in perpetual motion. Perhaps she is trying to complete her map by understanding what she removed. Perhaps she is learning that the blank spaces were never truly blank, only filled with a different kind of presence. The presence of cessation, of choices made to walk elsewhere, of the collective decision to let something end. Or perhaps she is teaching us still, through her spectral walking, that the most important cartography is the cartography of subtraction, that we understand places not by adding more lines to our maps, but by removing the lines that no longer serve truth. That accuracy is achieved not through exhaustive inclusion, but through careful exclusion, through the courage to say, this was here, but it is here no longer. And to draw that absence honestly is more valuable than to draw presence falsely. The road she mapped exists now in fragments, just as she drew it. The gaps have widened. More sections have ceased to matter. Her map, rejected as incomplete, has become over time the most accurate document of the road's true nature. Not a continuous thing, but a series of disconnected moments, some still alive, most faded into stone that no longer knows why it was placed. As the night deepens and your own thoughts begin their cartography of the day, measuring what mattered and what merely happened, you might consider M's lesson, that we carry maps in our minds of who we are, where we have been, what paths have shaped us. And perhaps the most honest thing we can do is not to draw every path we have walked, but to erase the ones that no longer carry our footsteps, to leave blank the routes we have abandoned, to mark as absent the roads we once believed were essential, but have learned to live without, to understand that incompleteness is not failure, but honesty, and that the truest maps show not where we can go, but where we actually walk. Not what exists, but what lives. Not the full geography of possibility, but the narrow, honest paths where our feet still fall, where our presence still matters, where the road, despite everything, continues to exist, not because stones say so, but because we choose again and again to walk it, or perhaps where it all ended, depending on which direction you measure, which way you face when standing at the threshold between intention and stone. The place is unremarkable. A flat circle of earth on the outskirts of what was once the empire's capital, though the capital itself has long since thinned to scattered foundations, to the memory of walls, to stories that grow vaguer with each retelling. The circle is barely visible now, distinguished from the surrounding desert only by a slight darkening of the soil, a subtle change in texture that speaks of something that once rested here, that pressed down for long enough to leave an impression even centuries cannot fully erase. No gate marks this spot. No pillar proclaims it. No inscription declares, here as the great road began. Yet soil studies confirm that something changed here, something was here. A density in the earth suggesting the presence of a structure now completely absorbed back into the ground from which it came. A threshold stone, perhaps. An archway. A simple marker that said to travelers, beyond this point, you are on the road. Beyond this point, your journey has formal beginning. It is evening when we arrive. The light is failing, withdrawing not in dramatic color, but in quiet diminishment. The sky fading from blue to gray, to a darkness that feels less like ending and more like opening, less like closure, and more like invitation into whatever waits beyond the boundary of sight. We stand at the circle's edge, looking inward. The ground is level, undisturbed except by wind. A few small stones rest on its surface, though whether they are remnants of something built or simply stones that wandered here from elsewhere, no one can say. The sand is fine, unmarked by recent footprints, speaking of a solitude that has lasted months, perhaps years, perhaps longer. Beneath the silence, everything we have followed rests here. The road that walked away from itself. It began here, or was it meant to end here in this quiet circle where travelers would touch the ground and make private promises before departing? The milestone that counted backward, it measured distance from this point, or perhaps towards this point, toward zero, toward the place where counting ceases and something else begins. The city at the 101st mile, with its wells now holding only sky. It was connected to this place by pale stones that believed connection mattered. That distance could be overcome, that separation was not permanent. The bridge over dry air, it spanned not just water but the space between leaving and arriving. And perhaps this circle was one shore, the place where crossing began or ended, or both at once. The inn where shadows arrived first. Did those shadows originate here, cast backward through time from this threshold, where future and present touched in ways they were not supposed to? The garden that walked north, did it begin its migration from earth fed by this place, carrying seeds that were first planted in soil that still remembers even now what it meant to give life to something meant to wander. The archives sealed in salt were the first contracts, the first witness agreements signed here, where the road began and travelers paused to make promises about what they would carry and how they would conduct themselves in the distances ahead. The watchtower that saw only inward, did its first guards receive their training here, learning to watch not outward toward approaching danger, but inward toward the subtle movements that precede all action, all choice, all beginning. The echo that answered in another language, did it learn its translation here, where the oldest words were first spoken, where language itself was young enough to remember what it meant before meaning became complicated by centuries of evolution? The cartographer who removed the road while walking it, did she begin her 3-year journey from this circle, stepping beyond it with blank parchment and the intention to draw only what lived, only what mattered, only what deserved to be remembered? Where memory fades, the beginning holds all possible endings. You step into the circle. The sand beneath your feet is cool now. The day's heat released, the night's cold not yet gathered. For a moment you simply stand, feeling the ground through your soles, wondering what it knows, what it remembers, what impression you are making on earth that may outlast your own memory of standing here. And you realize something that arrives not as thought, but as recognition, not as idea, but as simple truth. Perhaps the road never truly began here. Perhaps this was always a symbolic starting point, a place where travelers would pause, not because they were beginning a journey, but because beginning itself needed to be acknowledged, needed to be marked, needed to be felt as something distinct from the ordinary movement of days. Perhaps what stood here was not a gate, but a question. Not, where are you going? But why are you leaving? Not, what will you find? But what are you seeking that you believe exists at a distance from here? Not, how long will you be gone? But what are you promising yourself about who you will be when you return? The circle offered no answers. It only provided space for the asking. Beneath the silence, a different kind of speaking. It is said that those who departed from this place would perform small rituals before stepping beyond its boundary. Not grand ceremonies, not elaborate rites requiring priests or witnesses, but private gestures, personal acknowledgements of the threshold being crossed. Some would touch the ground, pressing their palms flat against the earth, feeling its solidity, its patient presence, taking a moment to remember that all journeys begin and end in ground, in the simple fact of earth holding us. Some would speak aloud what they carried, not the physical goods in their packs, but the intentions, the hopes, the fears, the reasons that made departure seem necessary, or possible, or inevitable. Some would simply stand in silence, eyes closed, breathing, allowing the moment of beginning to settle fully before the first step pulled them into the long sequence of steps that would follow. And the circle received all of this, held it, absorbed it into whatever capacity places have for remembering the private promises made within their boundaries. When the road began to dissolve, when the cities it connected started their decline, when the caravans thinned and the merchants found other routes, this circle may have been the first to sense the change. Not because fewer travelers departed from it, that came later, but because the quality of departures changed. The rituals grew perfunctory. The promises became hollow. The sense of a beginning as sacred threshold gave way to beginning as mere logistics, as the first item checked off a list rather than a moment of transformation. People still left, still traveled, still moved across the desert toward distant goals. But they no longer began. They only started. The difference is subtle but absolute. To begin is to acknowledge that something shifts, that you are not the same person beyond the circle as within it, that crossing this boundary requires something of you beyond the physical act of stepping. To start is simply to initiate motion, to set the body moving without necessarily engaging whatever else might need to move. The heart, the intention, the deeper agreement with the journey itself. When beginning ceased, the road began its withdrawal. Not because the physical stones knew or cared whether travelers acknowledged their departure properly, but because roads exist as agreements, and agreements require intention, and intention requires the kind of beginning that happens not in the feet, but in the chest, the belly, the quiet places where we make promises to ourselves about who we are willing to become. We settle now onto the ground, sitting in the circle's center, letting the evening deepen around us. The first stars appear overhead, shy at first, then bolder, then multiplying until the sky seems more light than darkness, more presence than absence. The air cools further. A faint breeze moves across the circle, carrying the scent of distances we cannot see, of horizons that exist beyond what eyes can reach. Where memory fades, silence speaks more clearly. If you listen, not with ears, but with the deeper listening that happens when ears grow tired and surrender, you might hear what this circle holds. The echo of countless footsteps, all pausing here, all hesitating at this threshold. The whisper of promises made, some kept, some broken, some forgotten before the first mile was completed. The breath of the travelers long gone, standing where you sit, feeling what you feel, wondering what you wonder about, what it means to begin, to depart, to believe that something waits elsewhere that cannot be found here. And beneath all of that, something quieter still. The question the circle always asked, never aloud, never insistently, but present in its very existence as a marked place, a deliberate threshold, a space set aside for the acknowledging of beginning. Do you need to go? Not should you or must you or is it wise to? Those are different questions, practical questions, questions that can be answered with reasons and justifications. But do you need to? In the deep place where need lives, the place beneath want and beyond should, the place where the body knows what the mind cannot always articulate. Do you need to leave? Do you need to seek? Do you need to believe that answers exist at a distance? That truth waits down a road? That transformation requires departure? The circle never judged the answer. It only held space for the asking. Some who stood here would realize in asking that they did not need to go, that what they sought was already present, already here, already available in the ground beneath their feet, if they could learn to feel it. And they would step back across the circle's boundary, return to the city, continue their lives with a quieter knowing that traveling far was not required for arriving home. Others would feel the need clarify, sharpen, become undeniable. Yes, they needed to go, not from restlessness or escape, but from genuine necessity, the kind that lives in bones, that cannot be argued with, that will make life impossible if denied. And they would step beyond the circle with the kind of beginning that transforms mere walking into pilgrimage, mere distance into sacred journey. Beneath the silence, the circle waits still. Perhaps it is waiting for you. Not the physical you, sitting or lying, wherever your body rests as you listen to these words, but the deeper you, the one who carries questions about beginning and ending, about roads taken and roads refused, about whether the journeys you have made were necessary or merely possible, whether the distances you have traveled brought you closer to what you sought or only taught you that what you sought was never about location. The circle cannot answer these questions. It can only hold them, can only provide space where they can be asked without needing to be answered immediately, without pressure to decide, without the weight of practical considerations, drowning out the quieter voice that knows things the practical mind cannot access. As the night deepens and the stars multiply, and the circle becomes less visible and more felt, you might imagine yourself in its center, not standing ready to depart, but sitting, resting, allowing the threshold to be what it has always been, not a place for going, but a place for pausing before going, a place for acknowledging that beginning matters, that departure is significant, that choosing to walk a road, it is different from simply walking it. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Some cities choose to survive as whispers, and some roads begin not in stone but in silence, in the quiet moment before the first step, in the pause that holds all possible journeys, in the circle that marks nothing except the sacred space between here and not here, between staying and going, between the self we know and the self we might become if we choose to walk beyond what is familiar into what waits, patient and unknown in the distances ahead. The road that walked away from itself is gone now. The milestones have fallen. The cities are sleeping beneath sand. The bridges span only memory. The gardens have migrated beyond maps. The archives have dissolved. The watchtowers have taught themselves to lie down. The echoes wait for the right listening. The cartographer walks gaps that widen each year. But the circle remains. Not because it is built of anything permanent, but because beginning never ends. Because as long as there are journeys to take, there must be places to begin them, spaces to pause before departing, thresholds where we can ask ourselves the questions that matter more than destinations. Where are you going? Why are you leaving? What do you seek? Who will you be when you return? Do you need to go? The circle holds these questions in its silent earth, in its darkening boundaries, in its patient waiting for the next traveler who will stand at its edge and wonder whether stepping beyond it means beginning a journey or simply starting to move. Whether the road ahead is calling to something necessary within them or merely offering the illusion that elsewhere is better than here. Tonight, you need not answer. Tonight, you need only rest in the asking. The circle knows, the road remembers, and somewhere beneath your feet, beneath your thoughts, beneath the layers of story and stone and sand, a threshold waits. Not for you to cross it, but for you to recognize it. Not for you to begin, but for you to understand what beginning means. Not for you to walk the road, but for you to know that all roads begin in the same place, in the quiet circle of your own heart, where you stand always at the threshold, where every moment offers departure, where beginning waits, patient as stone, gentle as evening, silent as the desert that holds everything. The road that was, the road that is, the road that might be, if only you pause long enough to feel the ground beneath your feet and ask the question that has no answer but leads to every journey. Why? And the circle, holding your question without judgment, without pressure, without need for immediate response, allows you finally to rest. Not in answering, but in knowing that the question itself is enough, that beginning can wait until beginning is ready, that the road, whether walked or not, whether present or vanished, whether stone or story, has already brought you here, to this moment, to this silence, to this gentle threshold, where sleep waits like a journey that requires no movement, only surrender, only trust, only the willingness to let go of roads entirely and rest at last in the quiet circle where all journeys end and begin and end again, endlessly, gently, in silence.